and welcome to another edition of the International Sunday School Lesson Plan. Today's lesson is for January the 14th. It's the winter quarter, lesson number 7. The title of today's lesson is A Bold Faith. And it's taken from Daniel, the 3rd chapter, verses 19 through 23 and 26 through 28. Okay. Now, a little bit of lesson background, if you'll remember back from last week, how that Daniel and his 3 buddies had worked out a deal where they would let they got carried off into captivity in Babylon, and they had worked out a deal where they would let them worship God the way that they believed, and the Babylonians had agreed to that, and Daniel and the 3 Hebrew children had arrived at a place of prominence and a place of honor and authority within the Babylonian kingdom because of the way God had blessed them. And things had been going along, and Nebuchadnezzar, who had toyed back and forth with worshiping God and believing in God between his idolatrous practices, he had toyed back and forth. I believe eventually he did end up being a person of faith, and we probably will end up in seeing old Nebuchadnezzar up in heaven, where he finally made things right and lived right. But he did have periods of time where he would get engrossed in his idolatrous practices. And he had, down to the south of Babylon, he had built this statue. And the commandment had went out for everybody to bow down and worship this statue. Now, the statue could either... There are 2 theories about that. One of them is that was a statue of Nebuchadnezzar. And as we know that, God had already said in several places how Nebuchadnezzar had a problem with arrogance and pride. So it may very well have been a statue of himself. It could have also been a statue of his idol that we find inside of his name, Nebuchadnezzar, Nebo. It could have also been an idol to the idolatrous god Nebo. Bible is not real clear which one it is, and either theory would be fine. But he had given that proclamation. He'd built this statue. He'd given a proclamation that everyone was to bow down and worship. And the 3 Hebrew children had firmly decided that they would not worship this graven image. And they had said, it's not in the verse is not in our lesson text this week, but I think it's one of the most important verses in this entire story. They had said, even if you kill us, king, we're not going to do it. The 3 Hebrew children, they were not depending on getting out of the penalty and paying the price for their faith. They had just determined that they were not going to go against God. That is what they had determined to do. And if the consequences of them living for God was being executed, they were willing to pay the price right then. And that's what they clearly said at this point. Now, there's a little bit of a mystery about this as we're going through the background information to the story. There's a little bit of a mystery about this, about where was Daniel in this story. We do not see Daniel at all in the story, only the 3 Hebrew children. And there's multiple theories to go along with this. First off, it's inconsistent with what we know about the character of Daniel, that he had bowed down to this idol. That's just an unacceptable explanation. So I would not even entertain that idea at all, that Daniel bowed down to the idol. There's maybe possibly during this time frame, Daniel was a very important person. It may have possibly have been that he was off on governmental business during this time frame and was not in the area when this occurred. It may also be because Daniel was above the 3 Hebrew children as far as in the government. It may also have been that people who were beyond a certain station did not have to do that, so Daniel was not included in the requirement to bow down to this graven image. It may possibly be that Daniel was involved in some other kind of government duties that had him locked up and sequestered and that kind of thing. There's a lot of times where people will be, people will be sequestered to perform some kind of function for the government, and it may possibly have been that Daniel was off doing that kind of thing, maybe not out of the city, but where he was totally unavailable to be summoned to that event. It may also have been that Daniel was sick and just on his bed of affliction and was just unavailable for this thing. But anyway, nonetheless, we have the 3 Hebrew children. They have been summoned up along with a lot of the other people, and they had been commanded to bow down to this graven image, and they had told the king, there's no way we're going to do this. You can kill us, you can do whatever you want to do, but there's no way we're going to do this. And this takes us to the point where we're at in the Bible reading this week. Daniel 3:19, the first part. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And all of us have worked in public jobs before, and you may have a boss that just thinks the world of you, but something happens, and then you can just tell it in their eyes. They don't think of you the same way. And people will get like this, and we see how that Nebuchadnezzar was absolutely filled with this blind rage against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Okay? 19b through 21. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. So we see here how that the three Hebrew children they were not any kind of preparation for them. There weren't any type of special clothing they put on them. They took them just exactly where they were and how they were dressed. And these strong men grabbed them up and threw them into this fiery furnace. And how that Nebuchadnezzar, and it may be that this is a furnace. It could have been used for a lot of things. Could have been a brick-making kind of furnace. It could also have been a furnace that was designated to punish people. There are a lot of, in that time period, that burning people alive was considered a reasonable practice, and it was considered a form of execution that was widely used. And it may be that this was just a special execution kind of furnace, but nonetheless, Nebuchadnezzar had them heat that furnace 7 times more than it usually was heated. This was just a stunningly hot furnace. And then 22 and 23, because the king's orders were urgent and the furnace overheated, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. Now, we don't know, just by the text here, we don't know if it was the people who threw him in. Did they get overcome with heat and just pass out into the fiery furnace? Did they scorch their lungs, which is a horrible kind of death that can happen to people, where they get super heated air hits their lungs and it burns their lungs. Did their lungs get burnt? But nonetheless, even the people who took the 3 Hebrew children and threw them into this fiery furnace, the thing was so hot, it killed the people who threw them into the fiery furnace. So there was no natural way that these 3 Hebrew children were going to survive this. Because even the people who got close enough to throw them into it died because of the heat. Things looked absolutely, completely bleak and without any type of deliverance at this point. Okay? Now, the lesson plan skips a couple of verses, but we know from the Bible reading how that Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, they look down and there they see them still surviving inside the fiery furnace. And they also, too, they see a 4th man, likened to the Son of God, as the King James says. And they see that 4th man in there. Now, you can either think that is an angel of God who went down there to be with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or you can believe that to be one of the early visitations of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, which is how I tend to look at this. Either way is fine. The Bible's not super clear about whether or not that was an angel, because we know how in other places in the Bible where angels are referred to as the sons of God. We know that in the book of Job, where God says, "And where were you, Job, when the sons of God leaped for joy?" And he was talking about the angelic host are talked about like that and referred to in that phrase. So it may possibly have been an angel. But I tend to think that was Jesus Christ coming down and in one of those before Bethlehem visitations that he had on this earth. You know, and then there are other places in the Old Testament where I believe that happened. The one where Brother Jacob saw at the battle, and he said, "Are you for us or against us?" And the Lord looked at him and said, "I'm neither, but I'm captain of the Lord's host." And there are those times, you know, the visitation that Abraham saw where God visited him. You know, that obviously was the pre-existent Christ visiting this earth. And so we see where that happens. That happened in the Old Testament multiple times. I believe that had happened in this time. Okay, Daniel, the 26th verse. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace. He declared, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire. So here they were. Nebuchadnezzar sees this great miraculous thing, which is the fact that God in his mercy let Nebuchadnezzar see these various things, I believe is what brought Nebuchadnezzar to a saving faith in the Lord. Because he did see several miraculous things as he went through, where God just miraculously performed miracles, and it brought him from this place of idolatry to a place of saving faith. And Nebuchadnezzar wasn't all the way there yet, but he was getting there. Okay? And this event, because he had ordered, the guys he ordered to throw those boys in that flaming fire died. That's how hot that thing was. And there they were, hanging out, walking around in the midst of that fiery furnace. And Nebuchadnezzar hollers down there to them and says, "Come out, come here. Y'all come on out. It's fine. You've proved your point. You and God and you have proved your point. It's all right now. Come on out." In the 27th verse, "And the satraps and the prefects, the governors and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed. Their cloaks were not harmed. And no smell," get this, "and no smell of fire had come upon them." Now that, my friends, is total deliverance. I don't know if you've ever went through a fire. Now, I've never been through a fire in my house, but I worked for a retail store one time that we had a bad fire in the store. And a lot of the stuff that was in that store, when it caught on fire, even if it didn't get hurt by the water, didn't get hurt by the flames, we couldn't sell it because it stunk so bad, because of that smoke had just seeped into like the couches and the chairs and stuff that were inside the appliance portion of that store. Just totally ruined that furniture. But now these guys, they didn't even have the stench of the smoke on them. When they come out, it was like it never happened. When we get to heaven, there's a lot of things in our lives that have scarred us over the years. All of us. I don't care who you are. There are things in life that hurt you and damage you, and yeah, you get over it and you get back on your feet and everything, but you might be carrying scars from it and all like that. But let me tell you something. On that resurrection morning, when the dead in Christ shall rise, when the living people who are alive are transformed, and that great resurrection happens, and we go up to live with Jesus, there will not be any of the hurtful, painful things that we've went through. And one of the things that is important for us to stop and think about on that resurrection morning and the story and how it's described in the book of Revelation, one of the things that's so important to realize is that God Almighty shall wipe away all tears. And you notice that is going to be after that great judgment. And the sheep and the goats are separated. And after we've got a chance to cry over the people who didn't make it, and we see the damage that has been done from sin in this world, and we see the horror that has been because of sin, and it's all over, and God Almighty wipes away all tears. And that's the vision of these 3 Hebrew children who came out of that fiery furnace. There wasn't even the smell of fire on them. The same stitch of clothes, every thread on them clothes was still on them. They hadn't bit a bit of burning on it. And that is what's going to happen with us after God wipes away all tears. Okay? And 28, Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants, who trusted in him and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Now that is leaving a testimony. That is living a testimony. And that is what we should do in our lives.